Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
We're most pleased to bring you a series of programs with the candidates for the United States House of Representatives from Idaho's 1st Congressional District. It is an open seat and it's receiving lots of attention. On today's program, we're pleased to welcome Mr. Larry Grant, who holds a BA degree from Columbia University and his law degree from the University of Denver Law School. He has been a practicing attorney and he's the former Vice President and General Counsel of Micron Technology in Idaho. Mr. Grant, welcome to the program. We're pleased to have you here, and Erna Reinhard, a permanent panel member, and I will ask you a series of questions, and we hope to get through 10 today. And thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's great to be back in northern Idaho again.
Our first three questions are on foreign policy, and I shall ask the first one. Following the 9/11 terrible crime when our country was targeted, the President of the United States and the Congress declared war on terrorists around the world. The first action was to go into Afghanistan and to overthrow the Taliban government that had provided a haven for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. In your opinion, after the overthrow of the Taliban government in Afghanistan, have we given sufficient attention to Afghanistan, including capturing Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and dealing with the resurgence of the Taliban?
Well, it's difficult to speculate as to what might or might not have happened. One can say, well, if we had put 150,000 troops in Afghanistan, maybe we would have captured Osama bin Laden. I think it's probably better to focus on what we did do, whether you agree or disagree with how we got to Iraq. We're there, and I think the important question now is how do we get out and get back to focusing on the war on terror, which you cannot fight with conventional weapons.
Yeah, we'll be talking about Iraq a little later, but just addressing the Afghanistan issue,
Yes.
Is there something there that we should be doing that you think we're not doing?
Well, again, it's hard to speculate. We now have seen most recently a resurgence of the Taliban. The opium crop is up. The tribal leaders are asserting control again. So one would say that we probably didn't accomplish our goal since we have not captured Osama or broken al-Qaeda. At this point, it's going to be very difficult to go back in and try to recapture that country since we've moved our troops out.
Okay.
I think we're going to have to get some international support and probably go back in and protect the Afghan government at this point.
Thank you. Erna?
Welcome to the show.
Thank
It's
you,
great to
Erna.
have you here. Thank you for being here. This is a two-part question about the war on Iraq. Did you support the invasion of Iraq is the first part of the question. And the second part is, now that we're there, what do you propose we do to stop the sectarian violence, stabilize the country, and avoid civil war?
Well, no, I was not in favor of invading Iraq because I think, as I mentioned earlier, that we took our eye off the ball. Iraq had no connection with Osama bin Laden. In fact, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein hated each other. Osama thought that Saddam was a non-believer. And so there was no connection there, and I think by invading Iraq, we took our eye off the ball, and we should have stayed in Afghanistan until we got the job done there. But again, whether you agree or disagree with that decision, we're there. We occupied the country. And I think the main problem, I don't want to be the first to advise the Bush administration, but when you occupy a country that is 60% Shia Muslim, it is not likely to end up to be a Christian democratic republic favorable to the United States. This kind of seems like fairly obvious to me. What we have to do now, you're right, we cannot accomplish anything in that country now until we stop the violence. My campaign manager has a couple of daughters living in Great Britain, and when you ask someone in America how to end the war, they say kill the terrorists. When you ask someone in Great Britain how to end the war, they say turn on the electricity. And I think this is instructive about what we need to do. We will never get the hearts and minds of those folks until we make their lives better. You do that by giving local control to local leaders. I read in the newspaper 2 or 3 days ago that the Iraqi army is now fighting the local militias. This is backwards. We should be recruiting those local militias to help us, because we can't tell the terrorists from those engaged in civil war. So you're going to have to stop the civil war, and the only way I know to stop the civil war is to give local leaders local control. The reason we're not doing it is we don't like some of those local leaders. But we're going to have to realize that these are the folks that can stop the violence. These are the folks that can help us end the violence, and they know who the terrorists are.
We need to move on now to
Yes.
one more in foreign policy. And of course, we keep staying in the Middle East here.
Yes.
What recommendations do you have to settle the disputes in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors, the Palestinian question, and of course the conflict that just happened in southern Lebanon? It's tied to all these other issues, and what do you think that we are not doing that we should do?
Well, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to do those kinds of things that are going to stop the underlying problem. And the underlying problem right now is Iran. There isn't any doubt in my mind that the current activity of Hamas and is generated out of other countries. It is not just a terrorist activity. It is a more organized movement. And we have to be able, again, to directly talk with folks. I would open up direct talks with Iran. I would open up direct talks with Hamas. And I know we're not supposed to talk to terrorist organizations, but the fact of the matter is they're the ones causing the problem. If you can't talk to them, then you can't stop the violence.
Thank you. Arno?
We now go on to domestic issues, and our first question is about immigration and our immigration policies. It's one of the most hotly debated issues in our country today. Mr. Grant, what are your proposals for addressing this issue, and if you become a member of Congress, what immigration reform policies would you recommend, including the security of our borders?
I think the only issue, or the biggest issue with immigration is whether you want to solve the problem or whether you just want to talk about it in order to get elected. I would prefer to solve the problem. You are really talking about 3 problems: border security, jobs, and immigration. For some reason, immigration has been connected to the first 2, but it really isn't. Coming here, getting a job, sneaking across the border, getting a job, does not entitle you to citizenship, nor should it. And why those 2 got connected, I don't know. But I'm convinced you cannot solve border security unless you solve the jobs issue. You can build a wall from San Diego to Brownsville, and as long as there are folks here willing to hire, and as long as there are folks willing to come, they'll come through San Francisco, Detroit, Seattle, New Orleans. They'll be here. And we have a work shortage. The answer is provide a job program that allows folks to move back and forth across that border legally, and allows employers to hire folks legally. And then the only people that will be sneaking across that desert are drug dealers and terrorists that we really want to take. But we're just so busy chasing folks across the desert who want to work that we can't address the other problems. So how do you do that? When I was at Micron, we were always short of engineers, but we could not hire a foreign national until we certified to the government that we couldn't find an American to do the job and we were paying a fair wage. So I would say any U.S. employer who needs an employee and wants to hire somebody from Mexico should certify they can't find an American, they're paying a fair wage, the folks aren't going to go on welfare while they're here, and they're going to go home when the job is done. That takes care of the worker program and makes border security much easier. And then the folks say, well, what do you do about the 11 million or so folks that are here? That answer is, if they're employed and productive, their employer should stand up and say, we like this person, we want them to stay, give them a work permit. If they want to immigrate, then they get in the end of the line like anybody else.
Our next question has to do with the budgets and deficits and national debt. For a number of years, we have witnessed a growing deficit, which has led to a larger national debt. Because of this soaring national debt, we're now forced to borrow large amounts of money from other countries such as China, Japan, and South Korea. There's not enough Americans to give them the loans they need. What would you do to address this national debt issue?
We get back to pay-as-you-go government. You know, Congress is on a spending spree like no other in history, and they just can't seem to get a handle on it. But it wasn't that long ago that we had rules in Congress that said you couldn't pass a law unless you knew how much it was going to cost, you knew where the money was coming from, and it could not increase the national debt. We were generating budget surpluses, and we were paying down the national debt. It was down to something, I think, between $3 and $4 trillion. In the last number of years, we've now had record budget deficits, and we're up to $9 trillion. Just get back to pay-as-you-go government. Just stop spending.
Due to our country's growing demand on, or dependence on foreign oil, which has resulted in rising energy and gas prices, what do you think are some solutions to this problem, and do you have any recommendations for alternative sources of energy?
Sure. There are a lot of things you can do, of course, wind energy, solar energy, all of these. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is with gasoline prices at $3 a gallon and oil at over 70. Well, it's just dropped the last few days. The oil companies are kind of shooting themselves in the foot because it makes alternative fuels and energy more affordable. But folks need to take a look at the refining capacity because right now what's happened is the margins that oil companies make refining the oil has gone up, even though the retailer's not making a lot of money. And folks need to understand that 60% of our oil comes from other countries, but 40% of our oil is domestically produced. And of course, the oil companies like $70 a barrel because that goes right into their pocket. So there's no incentive right now for the oil companies to lower the price. We're seeing a reduction in price now because we have a glut of inventory. But it's a policy issue, and I think some of the things, immediately you could raise the mileage standard on automobile. That would be the number one thing that would start cutting the oil. I think technology has shown us that we can drill in the Gulf, for example, and technology is getting better. But doing something like drilling in ANWR is, I just don't think we need to do that in order to accomplish the goal.
Another issue, of course, that's always important on the agenda is education. And the historically fact is that education was funded by local and state governments until more recent years, almost 100%. And it still is, of course, a great majority. But what do you perceive to be the role of the federal government in public education as illustrated by such recent plans and policies as the No Child Left Behind program?
Well, I think we ought to, I'm not sure who decided that a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. could run our schools better than local school districts, but I'm guessing it was probably a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. I think we need to call No Child Left Behind what it really is, which is the I Hate Public Schools Act. It is not designed to have public schools succeed. It's designed to have public schools fail because we're not providing the money to accomplish the goals that the federal government is setting. And to me, that's wrong. And I think we need to get back to where when the federal government wanted you to do something, they provided the money, and you either took the money and complied or you didn't take the money and not comply. But in this particular case, why would anybody not want to have public schools succeed? The answer is they would like to have vouchers and private schools. And of course, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you allow some students to leave the public schools are left with more problems. And of course, they can't handle the problems because you're not financing them, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the federal government wants you to do something, they should provide the money to do it when it's mandated. And then I think there's the whole educational question of whether or not teaching to the test is really the effective way to run an education system.
So under the No Child Left Behind, all the teachers are responsible at certain grades. They have to have a certain testing score.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Erna Reinhardt.
Our next question deals with lobbyists. So based upon recent revelations that some powerful lobbyists have engaged in illegal activity, which has resulted in several criminal prosecutions recently, what should Congress do to control or regulate the influence of lobbyists?
Well, the first thing you do is you elect congressmen that don't take bribes. You know, people would like to blame the lobbyists for the problem, but the fact of the matter is you cannot bribe a congressman unless he takes the money and puts it in his pocket. And this is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. This is a congressional problem. It runs all the way from Duke Cunningham in California, who had a list of defense contracts that he controlled, and he wrote down how much he wanted for each one of those in bribes, to William Jefferson on the other side, who had 90,000 cash in his freezer and has been caught on tape taking bribes. To me, it's a congressional problem. Congress should be able to police itself. Prior to about three and a half years ago, the House Ethics Committee was a bipartisan committee with a nonpartisan staff. It was effective, but that committee went over 3 years without a major investigation. And the reason it did that is that the current administration, the current leadership got reprimanded several times, so they decided to basically dismantle the committee. They've finally gotten it back together, and I understand that several months ago they finally opened an investigation. But we've now had 6 people, I believe, plead guilty to bribery at the highest levels of our government, and Congress has done nothing. We need strict rules about what congressmen can do and not do, and we need an enforcement mechanism from Congress to do it. The current answer is to lower the price of a congressman's lunch that you can buy from 50 to 20. So I guess the good news is your congressman just got cheaper.
The next question has to do with health. The health issue is such a large question. But one of the great concerns of Americans is the escalating cost of health care that also includes more than 40, now I've even heard as high as 45 million Americans without any health care coverage, including lots of children from low-income families. What solutions would you propose for solving this critical issue for the American people?
Well, I think this is a very critical issue, but I also think we don't have the national will to take some of the more radical approaches. I'm not in favor of a national health insurance. I'm not sure that the government really really can provide those services as well as private individuals. But there are certain things we can start with, certain baby steps, if you will, that we need to take. The first thing we need to do is revise the Medicare reimbursement schedule. The current schedule, it needs to be revised to reflect the actual cost of the services. Doctors at this point, because of the reimbursement schedule, are actually refusing to take Medicare patients. That's obviously backwards of what we want to do. Another thing we need to do is we need to look at prescription drug costs. You know, the Veterans Administration has the legal right to negotiate with drug companies for the cost of their prescription drugs. They're the only agency that can. There's no reason why Medicare or unions or other health groups can't negotiate the same way. Another issue would be reimportation of legal prescription drugs. The other thing you look at is equipment costs. You know, in any other industry, technology and competition brings prices down. That's not happening in the medical services industry. It means the system is somehow screwed up. Lastly, we need to get non-emergency patients out of the emergency room. The current number is, I think, 25% of normal health insurance premiums are covering the cost of non-covered individuals in the emergency room services. So we need wellness clinics. We need some kind of a mechanism for, you know, current administration is talking about raising your copay or increasing your deductible. Well, that doesn't do anything for those folks who don't have a copay and don't have a deductible to start with. So you need to look at the critical place and somehow get those folks into a different system.
And do you see a tie between the issue and the challenge of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, prescription drugs, this whole package, does it all need to be looked at in its entirety?
Well, I think you have to, because you can't really do one without affecting the other. But we have this situation now where, you know, oil companies get to write the energy policy, drug companies get to write Part D, and so, you know, they're going to come out pretty well. And we need to change that. We simply need to start looking them in the eye and saying, this ain't right, and we're not going to protect you anymore. You know, either lower your prices and be competitive, or we'll take some action.
Thank you.
Mr. Grant, what is your position on the use of federal public lands in the state of Idaho? And do you favor or oppose Congressman Simpson's bill regarding the use of public lands?
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 questions involved in that one. In terms of Boulder White Clouds, which is what I think you're referring to as Congressman Simpson's bill, I support that bill. I support it because the various groups involved have come together and hammered out a deal. Mike has worked very hard on that and has kept those folks at the table. Cecil Andrus says it's probably our last best chance to protect that area. Bethune Church likes it. The Conservation League likes it. Some of the ranchers like it. It's a group consensus of the stakeholders has come together, and I think we should all support that when groups sit down and solve a problem that otherwise looks insolvable. Same thing's happening right now with the Oahe Initiative, and so those groups, you know, we should support them as well. As far as the sale of public lands, the answer is no. There's certain times when it makes sense to trade something or get something of value, but selling off your capital is not a good thing to do, so no. Do we need to open up some areas to logging? Sure. We shouldn't close everything up. Just a common sense approach ought to be taken here on how we use some of our forests.
I'll do a quick follow-up on the public lands issue. One proposal that came up some time ago was to sell public lands in some states such as Idaho and take the money, one-time money for such things as aid over the Cortina issue in Louisiana and Mississippi. How would you respond to that?
Well, you know, this is the Congress who gave $8 billion to oil companies in the energy bill at a time when they are making the highest profits in their history, and then turns around 2 months later and tells us we have to balance the budget by cutting Medicare and student loans. This is a matter of priorities. There's plenty of money out there for schools. We simply have to reorganize our priorities. And no, you don't sell public lands. You don't sell your capital for a one-time shot, because when you do that, it's gone. And you never get it back, and the no trespassing signs go up, and most of the folks in Idaho are not going to have a chance to bid on it because it's going to go into private hands. So the answer is no. You just don't sell the public ground.
You've done a very precise job of covering our 10 questions. We had 10 that we wanted to cover, and we've been successful in getting through all 10 of them, and we appreciate that. And each candidate, we're asking at the end of the program for them to speak to the voters and give you that platform. And would you say to the voters of the 1st Congressional District why they should choose you as their next congressman?
Well, I think the most important thing to realize is that I've spent my entire career solving problems, whether that was in private practice as an attorney, representing clients, setting up businesses, or taking businesses apart, litigation, or at Micron, where we had significant challenges in the early history of that company. My job was to solve problems, and I think Congress needs problem solvers, not problem makers. I think we need to try to minimize partisan politics. You know, partisan politics are so bad right now that Dick Cheney is probably the only person in the country who could be criticized for shooting a lawyer. And so that's an important thing to understand, because, like I say, this is an all or nothing atmosphere we're in, where if you're for it, I'm against it. If you're against it, I'm for it. And I think we need to get over that and get back to some more moderation. More importantly, there was a great letter to the editor, and I wish I had clipped it the other day, where the person said, you know, it wasn't that long ago before when we had money in our pockets and we had friends around the world, and we no longer have that. When the Soviet Union fell, the United States really was the greatest nation on the face of the earth. We had an opportunity in history that comes along only very seldom to actually make the world a better place to live. One of the things I want to do is to restore America to the greatness and the respect that it deserves. And I think the only way you do that is by sending some folks back to Washington. I'm 60 years old. I've had a couple of good careers already. I'm not going back to have a long political career, and I'm not going back to establish a lobbying office after I'm done. I think the country is in trouble. I think we need folks to step up and help fix it, and that's why I'm running, and I think that's why folks should vote for me.
On behalf of Erna Reinhardt and our staff, Mr. Grant, thank you for taking time out to do our program and to speak to our questions and to the voters of the 1st Congressional District of Idaho. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are in a process of interviewing congressional candidates for the 1st District in the state of Idaho. And for you who are outside of our state, you may not be aware that this is an open seat, and the challengers are not against an incumbent. It has also been listed by some experts in the country as one of what's around approximately 45 congressional districts out of 435 that are competitive and are in play, and it certainly is receiving lots of attention, as well as those other districts around the country that are competitive. Join us again when we will continue our discussion with congressional candidates for the 1st District in the state of Idaho. And for you who are in other states, why, I hope you still have been interested in our discussions, because whoever gets elected in all the districts, obviously they vote on legislation and programs for the whole nation. I would like to invite you all, as I always do, to be with us again next week when we will be with you to discuss this important question of the future of our country. And until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.